there! Today, I want to show you how to create a display just like this one in Teta. First of all, let's change the background. So, let's click on Add to Body and then add a container to our app. Next, let's modify the color by clicking on Fill thanks to this button and proceed to change the color from black to white. Let's confirm, and we successfully modified the display's background color. At this point, let's proceed to create the app bar. In order to insert the app bar, the first thing you have to do is go on Scaffold and enable it by clicking on Show App Bar. At this point, a black bar will show up on our app, which can easily be changed by inserting within the app bar a container and proceeding this time as well to modify the color. Let's confirm and move on to changing the height of our container. Let's go on Height, enable it, and set a specific value, for instance 100. Next, let's go place our icons or even our images like our profile picture. Let's go on Add New following the container and add the row logo. Remember, a row can contain multiple objects. Now, let's add our icon, for instance to switch back, and our image, which will represent our profile. Next, let's change the various parameters. First, let's go on Row and set the main axis alignment to Start and the cross-axis alignment to Center. Now, let's change the icon and, for instance, look for an arrow that can hint to switching back. Let's scroll down through all of the Font Awesome icons and choose this one. At this point, let's change the size, for instance from 24 to 32, and move on. Now, let's change the profile picture. We will not be able to see the image of our app until we have set the size. So, let's go on Image, on Width, and set the width to 32 pixels. The same goes for the height, 32 pixels. Next, let's set the border radius to make the image round. Again, let's set it at 32. And we're set! We've created a profile picture. We can also make it bigger, for instance by setting the height to 48. We can see the changes in real time. A previous video on our channel explains this. You can find the link in the info or in the description box. Now, let's align them and go on Main Axis Alignment, setting it at Space Between. This way, they will be arranged at the right and the left of our bar. Next, let's add a padding right before the row by going on New Widget. We can now set a parameter both at our right and at our left, say at 24. Alright, let's try putting it lower. So, let's go on top and for instance set it at 24 pixels. Perfect! Our app bar is now finished. Now, let's go change the center of our app by moving towards the container and adding our widgets. For example, we can add a column to create a vertical element. Remember that just like the row, the column can contain multiple children, so we could almost create our whole display. For instance, let's add a text, then a row, because we can cross our widgets, meaning that we can put a row in a column or a column inside a row. So, let's go place our text, which for example can be our menu. Now, let's start changing our parameters. Let's go on Column, then Axis Alignment, and set it at Center. Next, let's modify our text parameters. This is going to be the title, so by changing the value to Product, we will add our title. We can also modify the font size, for instance by setting it at 32 pixels. And even the font weight, setting it for example at medium. Perfect! Now, let's add a padding right before the column. This way, we can tell our objects apart from the app bar. Moving on, let's add a padding top value of 24. We now have adequate space between the app bar and our widgets. Next, let's create our menu. By accessing our text within the row, we can begin our adjustments. First of all, let's access our row's parameters and set the main axis alignment to space between, as seen previously. Now, let's go on our column and make sure the container covers the whole width of the app. So, let's set our cross-axis alignment to stretch. Perfect! Next, let's go set our text alignment. We will have to access the title and give it a central alignment, as we can see in the Text Align section. To then modify our menu, all we need is a padding. So, right before the row, let's place our widget. And, as seen previously, let's set our left and right padding values to 24 pixels. Let's also add a padding top value to tell it apart from the title. And we're set. Our menu is almost done. Let's go change our parameters. In this case, the first text, the second text, and the third text. In order to then create the outline as we've seen previously, we must add right before the text a container which will completely surround it. Let's remember that as with the image, the container will not be shown until we have set its size. So, let's go on Sizes and enable the height. Next, let's set the width from max to 100 pixels and the height at 32. Now, we will set a color which, for instance, can be this shade right here. And then a border radius at a value of, let's say, 8. Great! In order to then center the text, all you have to do is enable the Center widget right before the text and immediately after the container. All set! We have perfectly centered our text within the container. We could also widen it a bit more by changing the sizes. For instance, by setting the width at 120, so to give our text more space. Let's switch back to our column and proceed to add another widget to it. Let's go on Add New and add a container. Now, as usual, let's add a padding right before the container and proceed to give it an adequate spacing from the menu above. Let's access the padding and set the top value at 24. Let's also add the same value on the right and on the left. We successfully added adequate spacing for our container. Now, let's modify it directly. So, let's access its properties and change the height to, say, at 350 pixels. Great! Now, let's change its color and pick a very light shade of pink. This should do it. And confirm. Now, let's set the border radius to give our sides the right border. 24 should be just fine. Next, let's add a Lottie to our app, more specifically within the container. We go on Add New and search for Lottie. Once inserted, it will take up the exact size of the container, kind of like water. But we can also change it. Let's access its parameters and, for instance, change the sizes. But first of all, we have to place a link. We can either add a Lottie directly from the Lottie website, already done, or we can create one in After Effects in the Adobe suite and manually add it to our Lottie profile. Next, we take the asset link and place it inside our text box. Now, let's press Command A to select everything, delete it, and Command V to insert it. As you can see, we have placed our Lottie very easily. Let's move on with our app. Let's make our container bigger to show our Lottie better. So, let's go on Height and now set it to 450. Perfect! Now, let's add our button bar to our app. As with the app bar, we have to enable it within the scaffold. So, let's add a container within the bottom bar widget. We can set a given size by selecting the height and setting it at 80 pixels. We can change the color and set it at white. Next, we add a row to contain all of our items. As a matter of fact, in Teta, the icon that represents the widget within the bottom bar is called bottom bar item. In this case, let's add 3 by accessing the menu, selecting the bottom bar item, and let's move on. In Teta, we can copy by pressing Command C. On the other hand, if accessing the object that contains it, the row in this case, we press Command V. Same thing when adding the third one. The bottom bar item has an initial size of 0 pixels, which we can change. For instance, let's set the size at 32 pixels. So, let's set the main axis alignment at space between and give a padding right before the row. For instance, let's set the left and right margin at 24 and the top value at 16. Let's go on the first bottom bar item, which can contain both an icon and the text. If we insert the text in our value field, the text will be placed within the bottom bar. But in this case, we will only be using icons, so let's go select the icon we like best. Let's search for Home, scroll down, and select our home. Next, let's access our second bottom bar item. Go on Item, scroll down, and select the one we like best. This one, for instance. Finally, when going on our third bottom bar item, let's select a last icon. For example, this one, which is our image. Perfect! Let's now change the color of our 3 icons. For example, by choosing this lighter shade of gray. We can also copy the hex code, and our app is all done. In just a few simple steps, we have created our application's display. Hey there! Today, I want to show you how to easily create a display just like this one in Teta. Let's go on Add to Body and proceed to add a container to our application. At this point, within the container, let's change the fill from black to white. Now we have our background. Next, let's proceed to add our app bar. First, let's access the scaffold and enable it thanks to Show App Bar. Let's go on Add App Bar widget and add a container. A black bar will be displayed, but don't worry, it's very simple to change its settings and parameters as we please. All we have to do is access it and modify the fill from black to, for instance, white. We can also very easily change its height and, for example, set it at 120 pixels. At this point, let's add a menu, a text, and a picture. To do so, let's go beyond the container and proceed to add a row. At this point, let's add an icon which we will need for our menu, and another row which we will need in order to add our text and our picture. Remember, it's very important to add a padding within the container in order to visualize our elements. So, let's unbind the link and, for example, set the top margin at 56 pixels, the left margin at 24 pixels, and the right margin at 24 as well. Now, let's go change our other parameters. Let's access our first icon and replace it with the menu icon. Next, let's modify our icon size. So, let's go on Size and, for instance, set it from 24 to 32 pixels. Now, the moment has come to place our text and picture as we please. First, the text, and then the picture. Regarding the text, let's access its properties and modify the value. Let's then set the fill from white to black. Set the font size from 16 to 18. And finally, the font weight from regular to medium. Moving on to our picture, let's access Image and proceed to change its size. So, let's go on the width and set it at 48 pixels. We will set our height at 48 as well. Now, let's add our border radius to make our picture round. Next, let's align our elements. All we have to do is access the row containing the text and the picture. We then set the main axis alignment at center and do the same thing for the cross-axis alignment. At this point, let's add a padding to have just the right spacing. So, let's first access the image, add it, and unbind the link. Let's now set the left padding to, say, 16 pixels. Our elements will all be stuck together at this point, so all we have to do is access the first row containing everything and set the main axis alignment to space between. As we can see, the icons and the text will be adequately spaced along our whole phone's display. Now, as seen previously, let's set our cross-axis alignment to center. Great! Everything is now perfectly aligned. Next, let's take off a bit of padding in our container. Perfect! Now, let's move on with the rest of our application. So, let's go beyond the container and add a column so to contain all of our body's elements. Let's then access its parameters and set the main axis alignment at start and the cross-axis alignment at stretch. Let's now add our body's elements. Let's start with a text for the title, a subtext for the subtitle, and finally a container for the search bar. Next, let's access the title and change the value from text to search. Let's then proceed to change the fill from white to black. At this point, let's set the font size from 16 to 24 and the font weight from regular to semi-bold. Now, let's access its parameters and start by setting the text value at what is happening. The fill again from white to black. And finally, the font size from 24 to 18. Next, let's focus on the search bar. Right before the container, let's proceed to add a padding. Let's then unbind the link and set both the left and right padding margins at, for example, 24 pixels. At this point, let's access the container's parameters and set a specific border radius. Let's change the color by clicking on Fill and, for example, choose a very light gray. First, let's enable the height and set it at, say, 56 pixels. Let's then add a row within the container and an icon within the search text. So, let's place an icon for the search bar and a text to insert the search text. Let's now access our icon's parameters and go on Icon. Let's scroll down until we find our Font Awesome icon of choice and confirm. Let's now change the text and start by modifying the color. More specifically, let's choose a very light shade of gray. At this point, let's add a padding to have enough space. Let's then unbind the link and, for instance, set the left padding at 16. Next, let's access our text and change our value to search. Let's now go on the row and, as usual, set the cross-axis alignment to center. Let's proceed to add a padding right before the row and after the container. Then, let's give a bit more left padding and not have it placed too close to our container. Let's also change the icon's color from black to a darker shade of gray. At this point, let's use a bit of padding to give our display a nicer look. So, let's go right before our text, here to be exact, and proceed to add a padding. Let's now proceed to give our title and our subtitle a left and right padding of 24 pixels. Perfect! Let's start by accessing the title and setting the padding top at 16 pixels. Next, let's access the subtitle and padding bottom of 16 pixels. Let's then access the search padding and add a padding bottom of 24 pixels. Perfect! Let's move on. Let's now add a title to then highlight our section. Next, let's set our text value to upcoming meetups. Then, change the color from white to black. Let's set the font weight from regular to medium and leave the font size the way it is. At this point, let's add a padding and more specifically set our left padding at, for instance, 24 pixels and our bottom padding at 24 as well. Now, here comes the interesting part. We are going to add a list view. Let's proceed to set our list view in a non-vertical position. We simply disable the Is Vertical button. At this point, within it, we can add all of our elements of choice. For example, let's start by adding a container. So, let's set the size and enable the height. For instance, let's set the width at 100 pixels and the height at 200. As we can see, nothing is being displayed. This is because when using a list view, we must first set a sized box right before the list view. More specifically, let's access this point right here and search for sized box. Now, let's access its properties. As we can see, its default value is set at 150 pixels. So, as we have done for the container, let's set it at 200 pixels here as well. At this point, let's go beyond the list view and add a padding to our container. So, let's access the padding, unbind the link, and set the left value at 24. Let's now increase our container's width and set it from 100 to 150. Our border radius will be set at, for example, 16 pixels. Let's then change the color, set to black, to this specific shade. Perfect! Now, within our container, let's proceed to add the texts and the icons. But we will need to add a column since they will initially be in a vertical position. Let's start with the icon, then a text, and finally another text. Let's access the icon's parameters and set the main axis alignment at center, and do the same for the cross-axis alignment. At this point, let's go on the icon's parameters and change it. Perfect! Let's then change the size and set it at 32 pixels. Next, let's set the fill from black to white and move on with our texts. Let's access the first one and set the value to 23 meetups. Now, let's access the second text and set the value to webhook. At this point, let's set the font size at 22 and the font weight at medium. Perfect! As usual, let's set our padding adequately to give a nicer look to our design. So, let's access the icon, click on padding, and move on. Let's access the padding bottom and set it at 16 pixels. At this point, let's add the rest of our elements to our list view. We now have 3 elements within our list view, and by scrolling, we can see how it works. Let's now, for example, add another text to pinpoint a new section of our application. So, let's access the column and add a text. Let's then access its parameters and set the value to Interested Meetups. Let's change the color from white to black and leave the font size at 16, while we can, for example, set the font weight at medium. As usual, let's add a padding, unbind the link, and set the left padding at 24. Let's set the top one at 24 as well. We now have one last thing to do. Let's add a row within the column. This will allow us to place our elements horizontally. The first one will be a container, while the second one will be a column. As a matter of fact, this will allow us to add horizontal elements within the row. Let's now add 2 texts. At this point, the time has come to play with our parameters just a bit. Let's access the container, enable the height, and set both the width and the height at 48 pixels. Next, let's change the fill from black to red. Now, in order to give a padding to everything, let's go right before the row and add it right here. This way, both the column and the container have the right padding. More specifically, let's unbind the link and both the left and the right padding set at 24. The same goes for the padding top value. Let's now access the container and make it round. So, as we know, let's set the radius at 48. Remember that Teta, by default, always adds a text to show us the added widget. So, in order to hide this text, let's access the container and the text. We can then take off the text value. Now, let's proceed to modify the two texts. Let's access the first one and start by setting the color from white to black. Let's then set the value to User Research on Web. Let's change the font size to 18 and the font weight at medium. Let's move on to the second text. Let's start by setting the value to, for example, February 28th, 2020 at 7 a.m., a bit on the early side. Let's then change the fill to black. At this point, let's give a padding to the title and the subtitle. So, as we know, all we have to do is add a padding right before the column. As a matter of fact, by setting the left padding to a value of, say, 24, we would be adding it to both of them. Perfect! All that is left to do is to repeat the same operation 3 more times. And we will have finished our app. In just a few simple steps, we were able to create a whole display in Teta. If you liked this video, leave a like. And if you have gotten to this point of the video, type #Teta in the comments section.